Hello, seventh period, and welcome to your final reading assignment. So, recording this one in two segments, and your final reading assignment begins on page 171. So, we'll start. The only thing was, he ought to go see the Latvian to get some tobacco. There might not be any left by morning. Shukov ate his supper without bread. A double portion and bread on top of it would be too rich, so he'd saved the bread. You get no thanks from your belly. It always forgets what you've done for it and comes begging in the next day. Shukov was finishing his gruel and hadn't really bothered to take in who was sitting around him. He didn't have to because he'd eaten his own good share of gruel and wasn't on the lookout for anybody else's. But all the same, he couldn't help seeing a tall old man, Y81, sit down on the other side of the table when somebody got up. Shukov knew he was from Gang 64, and in the line of the package room, he'd heard it was 64 that had gone to the Socialist Community Development today in place of 104. They'd been there all day out in the cold, putting barbed wire to make a compound for themselves. Shukov had been told that this old man had been in camps and prisons more years than you could count and had never come under any amnesty. When one 10-year stretch was over, they slapped on another. Shukov took a good look at him up close. In the camp, you could pick him out among all the men with their bent backs because he was straight as a ramrod. When he sat at the table, it looked like he was sitting on something to raise himself up higher. There hadn't been anything to shave off his head for a long time. He'd lost all his hair because of the good life. His eyes didn't shift around the mess hall all the time to see what was going on, and he was staring over Shukov's head and looking at something nobody else could see. He ate his thin gruel with a worn old wooden spoon, and he took his time. He didn't bend low down over the bowl like all the others did, but brought the spoon up to his mouth. He didn't have a single tooth, either top or bottom. He chewed the bread with his hard gums like they were teeth. His face was all worn out, but not like a goner's. It was dark and looked like it had been hewed out of stone. And you could tell from his big, rough hands with the dirt worked in them he hadn't spent many of his long years doing any of the soft jobs. You could see his mind was set on one thing, never to give in. He didn't put his 8 ounces in all filth on the table like everybody else, but laid it in a clean little piece of rag that had been washed over and over again. Shukov couldn't spend any more time looking at the old man. When he finished eating, he licked a spoon and pushed it into the top of his boot. Excuse me, guys. He jammed his cap on his head, got up, took his own bread ration and Caesars, and went out. You had to leave through the door. There were a couple of orderlies standing there. They had nothing else to do but unlock the door to let people out and close it after them. Shukov came out with a full belly, and he felt good. He thought he might look in on the Latvian, though there wasn't much time to go before lights out. So he headed for Barrack 7 and didn't stop off at his own barracks to leave the bread there. The moon was way up now. It was all white and clear and looked like it had been cut out of the sky. And the sky was clear too, and the stars were as bright as could be. The last thing he had time for now was looking at the sky, but he saw one thing. The cold wasn't letting up. Some of the fellows had heard from the free workers outside that it'd go down to 20 in the night and 40 by morning. From somewhere outside the camp, he could hear the noise of a tractor, and a bulldozer was grinding away on the new road they were building. And every time anybody walked or ran through the camp, you could hear the crunch of their felt boots in the snow. There was no wind. Shukov would have to pay the same as always for the tobacco, 1 ruble, 1 mug, though outside it cost 3 rubles and even more for better stuff. Prices in the camp were not like anywhere else because you couldn't have money here. Not many people had any, and it was very expensive. In the special camps, they didn't pay you a penny, but in Ust-Izma, Shukov got 30 rubles a month. And if you got any money from home, they didn't hand it over to you, but put it in an account in your own name, and once a month you could spend something out of this account in the stores with fancy soap, moldy cookies, and Prima cigarettes. And you had to write to the commandant beforehand and tell him what you wanted to buy, and if you didn't like the stuff, you could either take it or leave it, and if you didn't take it, you could say goodbye to your money anyway. They'd already taken it out of your account. Shukov got his money by doing odd jobs, making slippers for 2 rubles out of the rags the customer gave you, or patching up a jacket. You named the price for the job. Barrack 7 was not like 9 where he was. His had 2 big halves, but 7 had a long passageway with 10 doors off it, and each gang had a room to itself, 7 bunks to a room, and each room had its own latrine, and the guy in charge of the barracks had his own cubicle. The artists lived here in their own cubicles too. Shukov went into the part where the Latvian was. He was lying on a lower bunk with his feet up on the ledge, and he was jabbering in Latvian with the fellow next to him. Shukov sat down on the edge of the bunk and said hello, and the Latvian said hello, but didn't take his legs down. In small rooms like these, the men pricked up their ears to see who'd come and what he was after. They both knew this. That's why Shukov sat there talking about nothing very much. How are things? Not bad. Very cold today, yes. Shukov waited till others got back to their talk about the war in Korea. They were arguing whether there'd be a world war or not now the Chinese had come in. And then he leaned close to the Latvian. Got any tobacco? Sure, let me see. The Latvian took his feet off the ledge, dropped them on the floor, and sat up. He was real tight-fisted, this Latvian, and when he put the stuff in the plastic mug, he was always scared he'd give you one smoke more than you paid for. He showed Shukov his pouch and opened it up. Shukov took a little tobacco and put it on his hand. He saw it was the same as last time, the same brownish color and the same cut. He held it to his nose and smelled it. Yes, it was the same stuff. But what he said to Latvian was, "Don't look the same to me." "Yes, it is." Latvian got mad. "I always have the same. It's always the same." "Okay," Shukov said, "pack that mug for me and I'll have a smoke out of it. And then maybe I'll take another mug." He said pack because this fellow always sprinkled it sort of loose. The Latvian got another pouch from his pillow. It was fatter than the other one. And he took his mug out of the locker. This mug was made out of plastic, but Shukov knew just how much it'd hold and that it was as good as something made of glass. And the Latvian started filling it. "Press it down now, press it down," and Shukov poked his finger in to show him. I know how. The Latvian got mad again, pulled the mug away, and pressed down himself, but not so hard. Then he went on filling it. Meanwhile, Shukov opened his jacket and found the place in the wadded lining where he kept his 2-ruble bill. He eased it along through the wadding till it got to a little hole he'd made in another place and sewed up with 2 stitches. He pushed the bill this far, pulled out the stitches with his nails, folded the bills lengthways, and took it out of the hole. It was old and limp and didn't wrestle anymore. Someone in the room was yelling, "You think that old bastard in Moscow with the mustache is going to have mercy on you? He wouldn't give a damn about his own brother, never mind slobs like you." The great thing about a penal camp was that you had a hell lot of freedom. Back in Izma, if you said they couldn't get matches outside, they put you in the can and slapped on another 10 years. But here you could yell your head off about anything you liked, and the squealers didn't even bother to tell on you. The security fellows couldn't care less. The only trouble was you didn't have much time to talk about anything. "Hey, you're putting it in loose," Shukov grumbled. All right. The Latvian put a little more on top. Shukov took his own pouch out of the inside pocket he'd sewn himself and emptied the mugful of tobacco into it. "Okay," he said, "give me another mugful." He didn't bother about trying it out beforehand because he didn't want to have his first sweet smoke in a hurry. He haggled a little more with the Latvian and emptied another mugful into his pouch. He handed over his 2 rubles, nodded to the Latvian, and left. Then he chased back to his own barracks so he wouldn't miss Caesar when he came back with that package. But Caesar was already sitting in the lower bunk and gaping at the stuff. He'd spread it all out on his bed and on the locker, but it was a little dark because the light from the bulb on the ceiling was cut off by Shukov's bunk. Shukov bent down, got between the captain's bunk and Caesar's, and handed over the bread ration. "Your bread, Caesar Markovitch." He didn't say, "So you got it," because this would have been hinting about how he stood in line for him and that he had the right to a cut. He knew he had, but even after 8 years of hard labor, he was still no scavenger, and the more time went on, the more he stuck to his guns. But he wasn't master of his eyes. Like all the others, he had the eyes of a hawk, and in a flash, they ran over the things Caesar had laid out on the bed and the locker. But though he still hadn't taken the paper off them or opened the bags, Shukov couldn't help telling by this quick look and a sniff of the nose that Caesar had gotten sausage, canned milk, a large smoked fish, fat bat, crackers with one kind of smell, and cookies with another, and about 4 pounds of lump sugar. And then there was butter, cigarettes, and pipe tobacco. And that wasn't the end of it. Shukov saw all this in the time it took him to say, "Your bread, Caesar Markovitch." Caesar was in a real state like he was a drunk. People who got packages were always like this, and he waved the bread away. "You keep it, Ivan Denisovitch." Caesar's gruel, and now his 6 ounces of bread. That was a whole extra supper, and this, of course, was as much as he could hope to make on that package. And he stopped thinking right away that he might get any of this fancy stuff, and he shut it out of his mind. It was no good aggravating your belly for nothing. He had his own 10 ounces of bread, and now this ration of Caesar's, and then there was that hunk of bread and the mattress. That was more than enough. He'd eat Caesar's right away, get another pound in the morning, and he'd take some off to work with him. That was the way to live, and he'd leave that old ration where it was in the mattress for the time being. Good thing he'd sewn it in. Look how that fellow from 75 had stolen out of his locker, and there wasn't a thing you could do about it. Some people thought anybody who got packages was well off and fair game, but when you really got down to it, it was gone in no time. And just before a new package came in, there were only 2 guys to pick up an extra bowl of mush, and they went around caging butts. The guy with the package had to give something to his warder. his gang boss, and the trustee in his barracks. They often lost your package, and it didn't come up in the list for weeks. When you took it to the storeroom for safekeeping against thieves and on the commandant's orders, Caesar would be taking his there before roll call in the morning. You had to give the guy in charge. There was a good cut where he'd nibble his way through it. How could you keep a check on that rat sitting there all day with other people's food? Then you had to pay off people who'd help you get it, like Shukov. And if you wanted the guy in the wash house to give you back your own underwear from the wash, you had to let him have a little something too. Then there were those 2 or 3 cigarettes for the barber, so you'd wipe the razor on a piece of paper and not on your bare knees. And what about the guys in the CES so they'd put your letters aside for you and not lose them? Suppose you wanted to wangle a day off and lie around in bed. You couldn't go to the doctor with empty hands, and you had to give something to the fellow next to you in the bunk who shared your locker, like the captain shared Caesar's. He'd count every little piece you put in your mouth, and even the biggest heel couldn't get out of giving him something. Some fellows always thought the grass was greener on the other side of the fence. Let them envy other people if they wanted to, but Shukov knew what life was about, and he was not the kind who thought anybody owed him a living. He took his boots off and climbed up to his bunk. He got that piece of steel out of his mitten and had a good look at it. He figured he'd look for the right kind of stone tomorrow, to grind it down for a knife he could use to mend shoes. And in 4 or 5 days, if he worked at it little mornings and nights, he'd make himself a pretty good knife with a sharp curved blade, but meanwhile he'd have to hide it. He'd push it between the crosspiece and the boards of his bunk, and while the captain wasn't in his bunk down below, he wouldn't have wanted any dirt to fall on the captain's face. He pulled the heavy mattress back. It was stuffed with sawdust, not shavings, and then he hid the things there. Aloshka the Baptist and the 2 Estonians could see him doing it from their bunks, but he didn't have to worry about them. Petsikov came through the barracks, and he was crying. He was all hunched up, and there was blood on his lips, so he must have gotten beat up again for trying to scrounge somebody's bowl. He went past the whole gang, didn't look at anybody, and didn't bother hiding his tears. He climbed up to his bunk and dug his face in his mattress. You couldn't help feeling sorry for him if you thought about it. He'd never live out his time in the camp. He just didn't know how to do things right. And now the captain came along in a good mood with a pot full of tea. But it wasn't the kind they got in the camp. They had 2 tubs with tea in the barracks, but who'd call that tea? It was lukewarm and had the right color, but it was really just slops, and it smelled of rotten wood from the tub. But this tea was only for poor suckers. Well, the captain had gotten a fistful of real tea from Cesar and run off to get some boiling water. He looked pleased with himself and set it on the locker. I nearly scalded my fingers on the faucet, he said, as if he was proud of it. Caesar was spreading his stuff out on the sheets of paper in the bottom bunk. Shukov could see this through the cracks in the boards, and he put the mattress down again so he wouldn't get upset at the sight of it. But Caesar couldn't do without him. He stood up and peered over at Shukov and winked at him. I say, Shukov, be a good fellow and loan me that 10 days of yours, will you? What he wanted was Shukov's little penknife. You could get 10 days in the cooler if they found something like this on you. Shukov kept it in the boards under his bunk, too. It wasn't half as big as his little finger, but it could cut up a piece of fat back 10 inches thick like nobody's business. Shukov had made his knife himself and always kept it sharp. He stuck his hand under the board again and got it out. Caesar gave him a nod and ducked out of the sight. You could make something on a knife like that, but it meant the cooler if they found it on you. And if anybody borrowed it from you to cut off some sausage or something, he'd have to have a heart of stone if all you got out of it was a kick in the ass. So now Caesar owed him for this too. After all the business with the bread and knife, Shukov pulled out his pouch. He took out as much tobacco as he'd borrowed early that day, reached it over to the Estonian in the top bunk across from him, and said thanks. The Estonian spread his lips and sort of smiled at the other Estonian and jabbered something to him. Then they rolled themselves a cigarette out of it just to see what kind of tobacco Shukov had. It was no worse than theirs, so why not? Shukov would have lit up himself to try the stuff out, but he could feel from that the timekeeper he had inside of him. It was getting very near the night check. Before long, the warders would be snooping around the barracks. He'd have to go in the passageway for a smoke, but it was a warmer where he was in his bunk. The barracks was pretty cold, and that ice was still up there on the roof. It wasn't so bad right now, but he'd get frozen through in the night. Shukov started breaking off pieces from one of the hunks of bread, but he couldn't help hearing what the captain and Caesar were saying while they drank their tea. Help yourself, Captain. Don't wait to be asked. Have some of the smoked fish, too, and there's some sausage here, too. Thank you. I don't mind if I do. And put some butter on your bread. Real French bread from Moscow, you know. I say, it's hard to believe they make this sort of bread anywhere. All this luxury reminds me when I was an archangel once. There was a hell of racket in their part of the barracks. 200 fellows talking at once, but all the same, Shukov could hear them pound the rail outside, and he was the only one who did. He saw Snubnose, one of the warders, coming in the barracks. He was a stocky little fellow with a red face. He had a piece of paper in his hand, and you could see from this and from the way he walked that he hadn't come to catch smokers or to chase everybody out for the check. He was after somebody. He took a look at his paper and said, "Where's 104? Right here," they told him. The Estonians hid their cigarettes and waved their hands to get rid of the smoke. "And where's your boss?" "What do you want?" Turin said from his bunk and just put one foot down on the floor. "What's happening about the reports those two guys of yours were supposed to hand in about their extra clothing?" "They're writing them," Turin said, and he didn't even bat an eye. "They should have been handed in already. The trouble is they can hardly read or write, so it's not easy." It was Cesar and the captain he was talking about. He was a great guy, the boss. He was never at a loss what to say. "And they've got nothing to write with. There's no pens and no ink either." "There should be." "They always take them away from us." "You better watch what you say. I'll put you back in the can," Snubnose said. But he wasn't too mad. "But see you get these reports to the warder's room tomorrow morning, and they should say they've turned in those things they're not supposed to have to the personal property source. Got it?" "I get you." "Looks like the captain made it," Shukov said to himself. The captain hadn't heard what was going on. He was too busy telling his story and eating that sausage. "One more thing," the warder said. "Is S311 here? Is that one of yours?" "Let me take a look at the list," Turin said just to the stall. How could anybody remember all these damn numbers? He was playing for time, trying to drag things out till they called the men for the night check, and maybe then the captain wouldn't have to go to the cooler that night. But Snubnose shouted out, "Is Bavinsky here?" All right, guys, that's the first part of your reading homework. I will go ahead and do the first part of your reading homework. Don't forget, you have graded discussion questions. Be sure to find textual evidence for the graded discussion questions. God bless you.